I bought my first home years ago, during a time when the housing market was at its lowest. It wasn't much to look at, just a two-bedroom house with peeling paint, a tiny kitchen, and a yard that felt more like a patch of weeds. But it was mine, bought with the money I saved from working long hours and skipping luxuries. No cosigner, no loans from family, just me, stubbornly determined to make it on my own. I lived there for almost a decade, fixing things up bit by bit, whenever I had the time or money. The place had its quirks. A heater that rattled like it was alive, floors that creaked in the middle of the night, and a neighbor who always wanted to borrow something. But it was home. Then, life moved forward. I met Jake, the kind of guy who didn't care that my couch was secondhand or that my fridge made a weird buzzing noise. A few years later, we pooled our savings and upgraded to a bigger place. The new house had space for everything. A garden Jake was excited about, an extra bedroom for guests, and, most importantly, no more rattling heaters. I decided to hold on to my old house. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet, maybe rent it out or keep it as a fallback, but I couldn't bring myself to let it go. That little house had been my sanctuary, and I liked knowing it was still there, just in case. That's when my parents started hinting. They'd had a rough time financially, and things only got worse when they lost their home to foreclosure a few years back. Since then, they'd been bouncing from one rental to another, each one smaller and less stable than the last. My dad had retired early because of his health, and my mom had never worked. They were scraping by on his pension, but barely. One afternoon, during a casual visit, my mom said, "You know, your old house would be perfect for us. Small, manageable. I bet it's easier to heat than this dump we're in now." She laughed, but her eyes lingered on mine like she was waiting for me to agree. At first, I brushed it off. "I'm not sure what I'm doing with it yet," I said, trying to keep things vague. But the hints kept coming. Every visit, every phone call, my mom would find a way to bring it up. "I saw the cutest curtains that would look great in your old place," she'd say. Or, "Your dad could finally have a little garden again if we lived there." Eventually, she stopped hinting and just asked outright, "Why don't we move in? We could take care of the place for you. Maybe even fix it up. It'd be a win-win." It wasn't that I didn't want to help them. I did. But I'd worked so hard for that house, and the idea of just handing it over didn't sit right with me. I suggested a compromise. They could rent it for cheap, just enough to cover taxes and insurance. It was more than fair, considering they'd be paying far less than market value. To my surprise, they agreed. They'd recently come into a small inheritance, and my mom suggested using part of it to prepay the rent for a few years. I made it clear that this was rent, not a buy-in or some path to ownership. We drew up a lease, had it notarized, and everything seemed set. For a while, it worked. They moved in, and my mom wasted no time decorating. She painted the kitchen, planted flowers in the yard, and even replaced the old mailbox. I didn't mind. It made them happy, and I figured it was harmless. Looking back, maybe that was the first red flag. My mom started referring to the house as our place, and would talk about future projects like she'd be living there forever. I chalked it up to her excitement and let it slide. What was the harm? At the time, I didn't realize I was opening the door to something much bigger. Things were fine for a while, or at least I thought they were. My parents seemed happy in the house, and I was relieved that the arrangement was working. My mom kept herself busy with little projects, planting flowers, rearranging furniture, and adding small decorations she found at thrift stores. She'd call me every now and then with updates like, "I finally fixed that wobbly cabinet in the kitchen," or, "The rose bushes are really coming in nicely this year." I let her enjoy it. If it made her feel at home, what was the harm? But then came the insurance hike. It wasn't anything major, just a slight increase in the property taxes and insurance premiums that bumped their rent up by $5. I called to give them a heads up, thinking it was just a formality. "Hey, Mom," I said, keeping it casual. "Just wanted to let you know there's a small adjustment in the rent. Insurance went up a little, so starting next month, it'll be $5 more. Nothing big, just wanted to keep you in the loop." She went silent for a second, and I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then, out of nowhere, she snapped. $5? "Are you serious?" she said, her voice sharp. "After everything we've done for that house, you're really going to nickel and dime us?" I blinked, caught off guard. It's just to cover the insurance, I said, trying to keep my tone even. It's not like I'm making a profit here. You're still paying way below market value. But she wasn't having it. She launched into a tirade about how they'd paid off the house with their upfront rent and how I was greedy for asking for more. We've done so much for that place, she said. All the improvements we've made, all the money we've spent. You're lucky we haven't asked for more. Improvements? She was talking about flower beds and a fresh coat of paint, things she'd chosen to do because she wanted to, not because the house needed them. I reminded her of that, gently but firmly, and she only got angrier. You wouldn't even have that house if it weren't for us, she said, her voice rising. We made it a home again. This is how you repay us? By squeezing every penny you can? I didn't even know how to respond to that. The house had been mine for years before they moved in, and everything they'd done was purely cosmetic. It wasn't like they'd put on a new roof or fixed the plumbing, but she had convinced herself that their contributions gave them some sort of claim to the property. Then she dropped the real bombshell. Maybe we should let a judge decide, she said, her tone dripping with venom. I bet they'd side with us after seeing how much we've done for this place. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own mother, threatening to take me to court over a $5 rent increase and a garden she planted. I tried to stay calm, but my patience was wearing thin. Mom, I said, you signed a lease. You're tenants, not owners. If you're not happy with the arrangement, you're welcome to move. She gasped, like I just slapped her. You'd really throw your own parents out on the street? No one's throwing anyone out, I said, my voice tight. I'm just saying you have a choice. Either pay the rent we agreed on or find another place to live. It's that simple. She hung up on me, and I sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. I thought about calling my dad, hoping he'd be the voice of reason, but I knew he wouldn't take my side. He never did. Over the next few days, the messages started. Long, guilt-laden texts about how I was turning my back on family and forgetting everything they'd done for me. She painted herself as the victim, telling anyone who would listen that her ungrateful daughter was trying to evict her over pennies. I ignored most of it, hoping she'd calm down, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. My mom doesn't let things go, and I had a sinking feeling this was just the beginning. The silence didn't last long. A few days after our blowout, my dad called me. He rarely initiates calls unless my mom tells him to, so I already knew what this was about before I picked up. Hey, sweetheart, he said, his tone tentative, like he was walking on eggshells. Your mom's been pretty upset about everything. I was thinking maybe we could all sit down and talk this out. I sighed, already exhausted by the thought of another round of arguments. Dad, we've already talked. I don't know what else there is to say. The rent went up by $5, barely the cost of a cup of coffee. It's not a big deal. Well, he said, clearly choosing his words carefully, she feels like it's more than just the money. You know how much she's put into that house. She just doesn't feel appreciated. I closed my eyes, trying to keep my temper in check. Dad, I didn't ask her to do any of that. She chose to plant flowers and paint the mailbox. That doesn't give her some kind of claim to the property. He sighed, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. I know. I just think if you'd listen to her side, maybe you'd understand where she's coming from. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet them. I thought maybe if I could explain things in person, they'd finally see reason. We met at the house a few days later. As soon as I walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. My mom was sitting on the couch with a folder of papers in her lap, her expression tight and controlled. My dad was in his usual spot in the corner, looking like he wanted to disappear. Thanks for coming, my mom said, her tone cold. I just want to clear a few things up. I sat down, already bracing myself. She opened the folder and started pulling out papers, receipts for gardening supplies, paint, and a handful of small repairs they'd done over the years. She laid them out on the coffee table like evidence in a trial. These are all the things we've done to improve this house, she said, her voice sharp. The garden, the shed repairs, the new blinds in the living room. All of it cost money, and all of it added value to this place. I stared at the receipts, struggling to believe she thought this was a valid argument. Mom, You're renters. These are things you chose to do because you wanted to, not because I asked you to. None of this gives you ownership of the house." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "So, you're saying all the work we've put in means nothing? That we're just tenants, and you don't care about what we've done?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I appreciate the effort, but it doesn't change the facts. You signed a lease. You agreed to the terms. This is still my house." Her face hardened. Well, maybe a judge would see things differently. There it was again, the threat of court. I looked over at my dad, hoping he'd step in, but he just stared at the floor, avoiding my eyes. "Mom," I said, my patience running out, "if you really think you have a case, go ahead and take it to court. But I'm telling you right now, no judge is going to give you ownership of a house because you planted some flowers." Her expression didn't change, but I could tell I'd hit a nerve. She stood up abruptly, gathering her papers and shoving them back into the folder. "Fine," she said, her voice icy. "If that's how you want to play it, we'll see what happens." She stormed out of the room, leaving me alone with my dad. He looked at me helplessly and said, "She's just upset. You know how she gets." I stood up, suddenly feeling drained. "I do, Dad. That's the problem." I left without saying goodbye to my mom, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about control, about her trying to assert power over something that wasn't hers. And as much as I hated the thought of fighting with my own parents, I knew I couldn't let her win. The days following that meeting were eerily quiet. No calls, no texts, no cryptic messages from my mom. At first, I thought maybe she'd finally realized how absurd her argument was and decided to let it go. But deep down, I knew better. My mom isn't the type to back down, especially when she thinks she's been wronged. Sure enough, a week later, a letter arrived at my door. It wasn't from her directly, it was from a lawyer. My heart sank as I opened it, dreading what I might find. The letter claimed that my parents had a vested interest in the property due to their contributions to its upkeep and improvements. Attached were copies of the same receipts my mom had shown me at our meeting, along with a letter detailing all the ways their investments supposedly increased the house's value. I stared at the pages in disbelief. They were really doing this. My parents had actually taken things to the next level, turning a family disagreement into a legal battle. I felt a mix of anger and sadness. Anger that they'd stooped this low and sadness that our relationship had come to this. I immediately called my lawyer, who reassured me the claim was baseless. "They signed a lease," she said, her voice calm and confident. "They're tenants, not co-owners. None of this nonsense about flowers or blinds gives them any legal claim to the house." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. These were my parents, the people who were supposed to support me, not try to manipulate or undermine me. And yet, here we were, with lawyers involved over something as ridiculous as a garden. Not long after receiving the letter, my mom called me. Her tone was calm, almost smug, like she thought she'd already won. "I assume you got the letter," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I did," I replied flatly. "Good," she said. "Then you understand how serious we are about this. We've put a lot into that house, and we deserve to be recognized for it." "What exactly do you want, Mom?" I asked, cutting to the chase. She paused, as if savoring the moment, then said, "We want partial ownership. It's only fair, considering everything we've done. This doesn't have to get messy. You could just sign something and make it official." I couldn't believe the audacity. "You're asking me to give you part of my house?" She sighed, as if I were the unreasonable one. "It's not just about the house. It's about showing you appreciate what we've done. It's a gesture, that's all." "No," I said firmly. "The house is mine. You're tenants, nothing more. You signed a lease, and that's the deal. I'm not giving you anything." Her calm demeanor cracked. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat us? You wouldn't even have that house if it weren't for us." "Mom," I said, my voice tight with frustration, "I bought that house on my own, years before you ever lived there. You didn't help me then, and you're not helping me now." She let out a bitter laugh. "Well, we'll see what a judge has to say about that." I hung up, my hands shaking. It was one thing for her to make baseless threats, but dragging this into a courtroom? It was like I didn't even recognize her anymore. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. My lawyer and I gathered every document we could find. The lease, the deed, even old text messages where we discussed the rental terms. Meanwhile, my mom continued her campaign, reaching out to family members and spinning the story to make me look like the villain. "She's trying to evict us over nothing," she told one of my cousins. "We've put our hearts and souls into that house, and now she's turning her back on us." The worst part was that some of them believed her. I started getting messages from relatives, asking why I couldn't just let it go, or be the bigger person. I tried to explain my side, but it was exhausting. No matter how rational my argument was, my mom's emotional version of events seemed to carry more weight. By the time the court date rolled around, I was drained but determined. This wasn't just about winning the case. It was about standing up for myself and putting an end to her manipulations. If she thought she could guilt me into giving up my house, she was about to learn otherwise. The day of the court hearing arrived faster than I expected. I woke up feeling a knot in my stomach, a mix of nerves and frustration. This was my parents, for God's sake. Why were we here? Why had it come to this? I tried to remind myself that I was in the right, that I had done everything by the book. But it didn't make walking into that courtroom any easier. When I got there, my lawyer was already waiting, calm and collected. She gave me a reassuring nod, but I could tell she'd seen her fair share of absurd cases like this. My parents arrived a few minutes later. My mom looked smug, clutching that same folder of papers like it was her golden ticket. My dad, as usual, trailed behind her, avoiding eye contact. We all sat down, and the judge called the case. My mom wasted no time launching into her argument. She talked about how much they'd done for the house, how they'd transformed it with their improvements, how much time and money they'd invested, and how unfair it would be to ignore their contributions. She painted herself and my dad as the hardworking victims, just trying to secure a place they could finally call home. I listened, trying not to roll my eyes. She made it sound like they'd rebuilt the house from the ground up when, in reality, it was a few garden beds and a fresh coat of paint. When it was our turn, my lawyer calmly laid out the facts. She presented the lease agreement, the deed, and a detailed timeline showing that the house had been mine long before my parents ever moved in. She pointed out that every improvement my mom had made was purely cosmetic and voluntary, nothing I had requested or required. The judge listened patiently, asking a few questions here and there, but it was clear he wasn't buying my mom's argument. When my mom tried to insist that their work had increased the house's value, the judge asked if she had any appraisals or evidence to support that claim. She fumbled, saying it was obvious to anyone who looked at it. The judge wasn't swayed. After hearing both sides, he ruled in my favor, stating that the lease was legally binding and that my parents' actions didn't grant them any ownership or financial interest in the property. He even pointed out that their claims were based more on emotion than legal merit. I should have felt relieved, and in some ways I did. The law was on my side, and the nightmare was officially over, or so I thought. But as I left the courtroom, my mom shot me a look I'll never forget. It wasn't just anger. It was betrayal, like I had somehow ruined her life by not giving her what she wanted. We didn't speak as we left the building. My dad hesitated for a moment, looking like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He just followed her out the door, leaving me standing there, trying to process everything. The next day, I got a text from my mom. It was short and bitter. "We'll be out of your precious house by the end of the month. Don't bother contacting us." I stared at the message, feeling a strange mix of emotions. I'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. These were my parents, the people who had raised me, and now they hated me over something that should never have escalated this far. True to their word, they moved out by the end of the month. They didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a forwarding address, just packed up and left. When I walked through the house after they were gone, it felt emptier than it had in years. The garden my mom had been so proud of was overgrown, and the rooms felt cold and lifeless. I thought that would be the end of it, but my mom wasn't done. She started posting vague messages on social media about being betrayed by family and how blood should mean more than money. Some relatives reached out to me, asking what had happened, and I told them the truth. Most of them were supportive, but a few seemed to side with her, saying things like, she just wanted some stability, or, couldn't you have compromised? Compromised? I'd given them a home for a fraction of what it was worth, and they tried to take it from me. What else was I supposed to do? Despite everything, I couldn't shake the guilt completely. I knew I'd done the right thing legally, but emotionally, it still felt wrong. These were my parents. How did it get to the point where I had to evict them just to keep my house? Even now, I can't fully wrap my head around it. All I know is that I set boundaries, and they refused to respect them. Maybe that's what this was really about. Not the house, not the rent, but control. My mom wanted to feel like she was in charge, and when I stood my ground, she couldn't handle it. The house is mine again, but the cost of keeping it feels heavier than I ever expected. After they moved out, the silence was deafening. No calls, no texts, nothing. It felt strange, like a part of my life had been abruptly cut off, but I wasn't sure if I missed it or if I was just trying to process the emptiness. For a while, I avoided going back to the house. It felt tainted by everything that had happened. But eventually, I had to deal with it. When I walked through the door, it was like stepping into a time capsule. My mom's touches were everywhere. The curtains, the garden, even the faint smell of her lavender air freshener. It was a painful reminder of how things had spiraled out of control. I spent the next few weeks cleaning and repairing the place. Every time I pulled a weed or repainted a wall, I felt like I was reclaiming a little piece of myself. Slowly, the house started to feel like mine again. My mom didn't reach out, but I saw her posts online, passive-aggressive digs about selfish kids and family loyalty. At first, they stung. Then I realized I didn't have to engage. She could tell whatever story she wanted, but I knew the truth. Eventually, I found new tenants, a young couple just starting out, excited to make the place their own. Watching them settle and gave me a strange sense of closure. The house was finally moving forward, even if my relationship with my parents wasn't. I don't know if we'll ever fix things. Part of me hopes we will, but another part knows I can't keep bending over backward just to keep the peace. For now, I'm focusing on my own life and trying to move on. Sometimes, standing your ground means losing people you love. It hurts, but in the end, I think it's worth it. You can't build a future when you're stuck living in someone else's expectations.